Hello, dear friends. Welcome to this evening talk brought to you by the Spiritist Society of Bournemouth and Poole Christian Spiritualist Church. I am Fabrício Assunção from the Spiritist Society of Bournemouth. We broadcast many Spiritist studies online each week in English or Portuguese. If you'd like to take part or tune in to any of our activities, please go to our Facebook page for further details. For our talk tonight, we are honored to have our guest speaker, Tanya Moore, speaking to us tonight from Ireland. Tanya is a member of the Spiritist Society of Ireland and currently lives in Ireland. She studies Spiritism and has lived in London for many years. Her talk will be on Joanna de Angelis' book, Family Constellations. A big welcome to you, Tanya.
Thank you, Fabrizio.
Tonight's event is one of our series of fortnightly talks exploring the psychological series books of the spirit of Joanna de Angelis. These books were psychographed by the famous Spiritist medium Divaldo Franco. Through Divaldo's mediumship, the spirit of Joanna has written hundreds of books during the last 40 years, including poems and other spiritual works. We are very much look forward to the talk tonight, Tanya. Thank you for being with us. But before then, let's go to our friend Lawrence Saville at the Poole Christian Spiritualist Church for our opening prayer. Over to you, Lawrence.
Thanks, Fabricio, and a very good evening and a warm welcome to you too, Tanya. It's lovely to meet you. So, dear friends, if we could just take this time just to sit quietly, to leave at our doors all our cares, our concerns, our worries of this time, and immerse ourselves within that divine truth, love, and knowledge that we live but one life, a continuous existence reflected in many ways, forms, and shapes. But the thread of life is never broken, just changed, adapted, and growing. And as we join in tonight upon this energy, we open up our minds and our hearts to the words and the power of Spirit. Amen.
Amen. Thank you, Lawrence. Now it's my great pleasure to hand over to Tanya for her talk about family constellations. Over to you, Tanya.
Thank you both, and thank you, Lawrence, for running the slides for me. Much appreciated. Teamwork. Teamwork is the theme of you guys. Actually, great teamwork. Well done. I've watched many talks over the last 15 months, and it's been, really, really wonderful to see the fruit of that collaboration and a number of great talks that I've enjoyed from the west of Ireland. So this is an introduction, really, to a book called Family Constellation by Joanna de Angelis. And to be fair, I don't think it really is going to do justice to the book. It's not to denigrate the talk before I start, but what I would hope is that a little of what I am sharing tonight of the ideas of the Spirit would perhaps trigger some to consider reading the book, because I think it's got some incredibly valuable ideas that looks at the family from very insightful angles. And interestingly enough, separately with work, I was doing research in related areas and found a couple of studies that very much confirm effectively the ideas that are put forward in this book. So effectively, it shines a light on the opportunity that the family can bring to help us to grow spiritually once we learn how to make the best of it. In the book, it's structured in a very sort of sequential way. She talks about parents, children, siblings. There's a chapter on each: grandparents, aunts and uncles, neighbors, and then education on peace in the family, education in the home, education regarding friendship, education through work on courage, sexual education, social relationships, family relationships, behavioral disorders, spiritual guidance, drug addictions, death. It goes through a whole range of different subjects, all within the family setting and the home setting. So it's really, I think, a very interesting 360 of the family. So next slide, please, Lawrence. So here, just to contextualize it within the work of Allan Kardec, this is a quote from the Spirit's book, question 775, which, if I was to reframe it today, would probably say the opportunity that the family gives us is to learn to be selfless, to learn to think of others, to learn to be exposed to the wishes, desires, and needs of others. And I think the last 15 months have really shown how we need each other more than ever before, particularly when some had to, as we said in Ireland, cocooning, shielding, I think in the UK, where people were reliant on friends, family, neighbours to be there for each other. And it, I think, brought out the best in a lot of people, and certainly in certain families. It definitely, I think, brought many families closer together and brought a greater sense of solidarity. Notwithstanding that, I know it's also been very challenging in certain family settings, and domestic violence and abuse did rise in some homes, which is obviously very unfortunate. So I think it polarized to an extent the challenges and the opportunities. And so this book isn't going to be a quick fix for anything, but it does provide, I think, guidelines that could be helpful to improve family relationships. So next slide, please, Lawrence. So again, just for context, within Spiritism and Spiritualism, we know that the family is a setting of biological ties, but there may well be spiritual ties that extend well beyond the life of the physical body. And so there can be individuals who are not in our biological family, but with whom we have great affinity, an instant connection, a real sense of affinity, commonality, common interests, and love and affection. And so often you will see one can find oneself part of more than one family. There's, of course, one's biological family, but I think also we may at times find ourselves part of other families because of the strong bonds of love and affection and shared interests. So going on to the next slide. So now going into the thoughts and ideas of Joanna de Angelis, she basically shares that the home is where we start learning to develop the capacity for universal love. And this is a repeating theme that she keeps coming back to, that it's where we take those first steps to develop a love for one another in a much bigger sense as a society, learning how to care for each other, learning how to care about each other. And her opening point is that we start developing this in the home. We prepare ourselves there someday to be able to make our own contribution to society, that we start developing the abilities and the skills to make a positive, in her words, a noble contribution to society. She also makes the point, as alluded to earlier, that there are those who are immature, irresponsible, and maybe young in body or maybe young in spirit, who can undermine the family when they get drawn in and seduced by the pleasures of life, that often are held up as something to aspire to by media and the society, and so can end up neglecting important responsibilities to the family and to the home. And can get distracted. Basically, materialism is that pull. It predominates in the media and in society currently, generally, pulling the focus of our mind and our behaviors onto the physical body and onto excesses that actually can end up being very detrimental to our health. In her words, humans end up rushing in to experience all sorts of sensations, no matter what the cost, rather than really focusing on what brings well-being. So the family can end up becoming a battleground between, on the one hand, sobriety, balance, harmony, and on the other hand, that sort of pull for excess, for entertainment, that can seem quite hip and cool at the time, and actually is media really focuses on as something that we are to aspire to. Another point that she makes is that enduring values that dignify the spirit can actually nowadays be looked down on, where the focus is instead on the here and now. And so that got me thinking, you know, quite often the two words family values is something that can be quite denigrated. And it got me thinking about how family values, I think different people will have different associations with that. For some, it may have a negative association. They may see it as something very traditional, very conservative, not inclusive, perhaps something dogmatic. And certainly as you read through the book, you'll see it's anything but that it's about creating a support system that is about helping the spirits that are born into that family to grow, to develop themselves psychologically, emotionally, and spiritually, to learn to lead a good life, learning solidarity, learning patience, learning compassion, learning how to socialize, learning how to express themselves, to share what they're feeling, learning to focus on the things that matter in life rather than getting distracted by things that could well lead down paths that may be very, very harmful. And she doesn't pull any punches in the way she describes that at times. So that often she makes the point that because young people can lack a solid base at home, they can end up going into gangs and reacting against the family structure, the institution of the family, because they don't have that base at home. They don't have that emotional safety net. And so they go out and try and build their own sense of identity, which can end up being quite aggressive, which is often a sign of insecurity. Arrogance generally can be a cover for insecurity. And so this theme of, you know, young people, teenagers getting not having that guidance system at home, not having that support system, that psychological and emotional safety at home, going into gangs and the antisocial behaviours that may result from that, got me thinking of a study I read recently about work that happened in Iceland, because this was very much the case in the early 90s, that apparently if you went down to downtown Reykjavik, you would see an awful lot of teens getting drunk and disorderly, and actually it wasn't particularly safe. And so it triggered major changes. They started to look for solutions, best practice in other countries, and in particular got in touch with a US academic who had looked into why would kids get pulled into drug addiction, and basically sort of was trying to see what would be the triggers for somebody starting to abuse, what would trigger them to actually try it in the first place, and what are the protective factors and what are the risk factors. And so effectively found that kids will go looking for one of two things. On the one hand, they're looking for a high, they're looking for buzz. On the other hand, they may have anxieties, social anxiety with regard to school, whatever it may be. So what they're looking for is something that's more of a downer. And so looking for two very different types of drugs. So, you know, basically the uppers and the downers, and alcohol firmly in sort of the downer camp. and sort of, I wouldn't say soothing and calming, but certainly helping to deaden what could be anxiety. And instead sort of started thinking, okay, what are alternate ways of achieving the same end? What are the natural highs that can help kids to feel high in life, to feel good about life, or to help soothe and calm them if they are feeling anxious and upset or nervous and are having problems self-regulating. And so they did a big analysis of teens and found certain themes that were very interesting. So protective factors were when kids were spending 4 or more times a week playing sports. They were very low risk at falling into drug or alcohol abuse. If they were likewise very much going into music, the arts, acting, dance, again, really lowered the risk of them getting pulled in, because they were getting that natural high, or in the case of music, probably more of a soothing, calming, depending on the type of music. Art, again, would be, I guess, more soothing. And so another protective factor, and that if it went the other way could be a risk factor, was the amount of time that they spent with their family, notably on weekdays. So this was at a time in the 90s when it was all about quality time, having really good quality time with the kids. And what the research is showing is, yes, have quality time, but that's not, you can't have a quality hour and that's it, then hands off for the rest of the week, because then the risk factor is very, very high that kid doesn't have the support they need to deal with the issues that arise as they go through their teenage years. And so spending time with the parents on weekdays was clearly a key thing for them to look to encourage. And so I'll get into that a bit more in the next slide. But effectively, the state then started to put in place changes where they started to increase funding for organised sports, for music, art, dance, other types of clubs, to give kids an alternative way to get higher, to soothe themselves, but also alternative ways to belong, to feel part of a group and to feel good about themselves. Basically an alternative to alcohol and drugs. And for kids from low-income families, they were given grants, they were given help to be able to take part. So in Reykjavik, which is where about a third of the population lives, families were given the equivalent of about 250 sterling per year per child to fund those recreational activities so that they would participate in the same way that kids from more affluent backgrounds. So I'll come back to that in a moment, but basically just to sort of continue with her thinking on this, there were those who she speaks about who really lived it up in the 60s, who lived the dream as they saw it back then, with all the kind of the drop of the traditional ways and the freedom, the revolution that came in the 60s. But who then, she makes the point, found that they were unable to build families, and in many cases ended up with kids who were even more rebellious than they were, and so would then find themselves later in life, in many cases, addicted to drugs and often alone and very lonely. And so having invested time in, again, that pull to the physical, rather than looking at something that's more, certainly more spiritual and more about building an enduring foundation that will be there through life, namely investing in family. Naturally, she makes the point that there are always exceptions. She very much highlights that monogamy is a really strong expression of affection from an anthropological, sociological, psychological, and evolutionary perspective. It shows respect one for the other. It shows loyalty, and that ultimately we as human beings are inherently, innately designed to live in families, to help us to develop ourselves spiritually, to evolve the psyche. We've got a lot within us that is potential, that is dormant, and that stimulation within the home is where we can get the opportunity to realize it, and that potential. What is instinctive in animals who care for their young, she highlights, is even more evolved in humans, and manifests as great care and protection for their young, and within human families as well, to the extent that it involves even sacrificing one's own needs and one's own desires to take care of the others. And that can obviously be parents for kids, and you'll often find those who are in the mid stages of life where they're caring for kids, and then they can be now starting to care for the generation ahead of them. And I think I certainly over the last 15 months have seen amazing examples of family really pulling together in order to be able to provide that support and care for the older generation, or for families where there may be kids with or indeed adults with additional needs, challenging, but people really rising to that challenge in admirable ways. So she goes on to say, this divine energy of caring for others finds an ideal place in the family to grow. That, the family, when the couple has the child, they are welcoming these tiny little fragile beings who in effect are nothing more than spirits, just as the rest of us are, who are restarting on their journey. And so they, in some cases, may be even more advanced spiritually, and in others they may be at the same level, or indeed a bit behind. But for a brief period, they're very, very vulnerable and completely reliant on the adults around them. And the work of Bowlby, a psychologist I think it was in the 50s, shows that actually it doesn't have to be necessarily biological parents. It's just that strong, secure connection to love that is reliable and constant, that can build that psychological and emotional safety net that will be deep in the psyche of that individual as they grow. And so investing in that for these spirits returning in these tiny little fragile bodies. And sometimes I look at babies and young kids and toddlers and think, who are you really? You see this gorgeous, adorable little bundle of life, and you think, a couple of years ago, you could well have been looking at us and smiling at us and sort of ruefully thinking, oh, what are they doing with that? That they may be more advanced than us. And this is said that there are spirits reincarnating who are more advanced in order to help us to advance. And for that brief period, they're in the body of children. Anyway, it's just something at times that I find myself looking at children and sort of wondering, wow, who could this be in relation to us? Truly, it may well be a very, very close friend or family member from the past. So if you wouldn't mind, Lawrence, moving on to the next slide, to the fortress, please. So an analogy she makes is that ideally the family should be a safe fortress to protect us from any outside aggression or disturbance from the outside world, a space for us to mature ourselves psychologically and emotionally, to gain experience, to grow ourselves so that we can have a happy journey throughout our life and through society. And so, as I mentioned earlier, spending time with family and parents was found in the 90s to be a protective factor, and not doing it was very much found to be a risk factor. So those that weren't spending time were more likely to be abusing drugs and alcohol. And so as a result, the government encouraged parents to attend talks on the importance of spending a quantity of time with their kids rather than just quality time. And specifically, the dialogue was to talk to their kids about their lives, find out who their friends were, what was going on in their lives, and also, perhaps controversially in other countries, certainly this is the one thing of all the changes they made that wasn't taken on by others, was they introduced a curfew. The kids, what they found was, again, a protective factor was if children were not allowed to be out late, kids that were allowed to be out as late as they wanted were very much at risk of going down the drugs and alcohol abuse route. And so the government decided if parents aren't enforcing that, then we as a society will override and be the parent. And so for kids between, I think it was 15 and 16, they had to be home by 10 o'clock at night during the winter and by midnight in summer, which I think was really interesting. And basically what parents found was that by putting that curfew into law, it strengthened the authority that the parents had with their kids, because it wasn't, oh, but so-and-so is, you know, it was actually, no, we have to do this. And links between parents and schools were strengthened through parental organizations, which by law had to be established in every school, along with school councils with representatives who are parents. So really building strong connections in between the education in the home and the education in the school, and getting them to work together and empowering parents and effectively opening up dialogues between the teachers and the parents, but also across the parents, so that I guess they would normalize and set a norm in terms of what was acceptable and what wasn't. Now, for kids age 13 and up, parents were invited to make a pledge to follow all the recommendations. So those recommendations included things like not allowing kids to have unsupervised parties, not buying alcohol for minors, and really focusing in on the well-being of not just their own children, but of the other children as well, which is, I think, you know, again, talking about sort of traditional values, that would have been the case before, where you had people living in strong communities, where this, you know, neighbors and friends of family looked out for the kids as much as the parents did. So, you know, they say, what is the expression? It takes a village to bring up a child. I was lucky. I grew up in Ireland, we call it a town. In the UK, you definitely call it a village, 1,500 people. But you felt safe because wherever you were, there was people that you knew. And so what was a risk factor, i.e. not spending time with family, became in Iceland a protecting factor. So between 1997 and 2012, the percentage of children aged between 15 and 16 who reported often or almost always spending time with their parents on weekdays doubled from 23% to 46%. And the percentage who participated in organised sports at least 4 times a week doubled as well, from 24 to 42%. And at the same time, cigarette smoking, drinking, cannabis use plummeted by, I think it was 60 to 80%, depending on the category. So, and 90% in some cases. So they went from basically being one of the worst in Europe in terms of teen abuse of drugs and alcohol and antisocial behaviours to becoming head and shoulders the best in the space of 15 years, which is, I think, absolutely phenomenal. Why am I focusing in on this? It may seem that I'm kind of going off piste, and as I now wend my way back into the piste, effectively, Joanna De Angelis has a chapter in the book, later in the book, dedicated to the issue of drug addiction in the family. And basically, she pretty well much says a lot of what Iceland encouraged parents to do, namely spend time with the children. She specifically says eat meals together, talk to them about their day-to-day lives over the mealtime, get to know what's on their mind, find out what's worrying them, help them find solutions, help them find perspectives on, you know, for example, COVID, on the economy, on whatever it may be, on drugs. So being very present in their lives and developing really strong, open dialogues. She says, because she then goes on to talk about also giving spiritual education in the home, that should come from the family unit. It's not necessarily going to come from the school, depending on the choice of school, but that the importance of helping to provide that spiritual base for the child, so that they can effectively have that as an emotional haven, as she calls it, a safe place that provides them with a strong foundation when they face into the issues and the challenges that life inevitably will send them. And for the most part, research does show that having faith, having a spiritual belief is a protective factor for physical and mental health, as long as it's not, and actually she confirms this. I've heard this from a psychiatrist at the recent Spiritist Medical Congress, but also in her book, she speaks about as long as it's not dogmatic, not extremeness, not fanatical, not demanding, but something that is reassuring, that is focusing on internal truths, that is about developing good qualities, something that's open-minded. And so I think it really challenges what, you know, that again, going back to that thing about family values, where some may have a negative, you know, that it's like, oh, eyes to the heaven family values. It's like, actually, it depends on what you mean by the word. If it's to be there, to love one another, to show solidarity, to value relationships more than things, to be patient with each other, to learn to be generous with each other, to learn to be forgiving. I think most would agree that these would be values that most of us, if not all of us, would value, that others certainly show towards us, and that it certainly would be a benefit for us to learn to be able to do it and reciprocate it in our turn. So I can now close the parenthesis on Iceland and wave goodbye. So Lawrence, if you wouldn't mind moving on to the next slide, please. She talks about how the family is also like a primary school, an incredibly important primary school, which helps lay down the foundation of the personality, and where, for example, we can learn to develop the capacity for affection, to learn to be affectionate towards each other. And you can certainly see within some families there can be great variance in that, and even within cultures or across cultures there can be great variance, and there can be different ways of showing affection. In some it may be done verbally, in others it may be something quite physical, but in effect we are, again, repeating what she says, biological, psychological, social, emotional, spiritual beings, and so we can't do without family life. There's something in us innately that leads us to seek out belonging to a group naturally, just as we see in animals who live in family groups to protect the young, to protect the vulnerable, and to prepare the young to one day become self-sufficient. And so she makes the point about how the family can be scorned and ridiculed in modern day society, that, you know, can be quite cynical when it comes to talking about the family as the institution of the family. And it got me thinking. I was trying to think of what would be an example of that, and what came to mind was on TV, the depiction of the family in certain TV programs or in films, where there tends to be more of a focus, not on role model families, but on highly dysfunctional families, And certainly a number of years ago, there was a program that I used to watch, and I'll admit I actually used to find quite funny. Until then, somebody pointed out to me, who was a parent, a dad, and he said that he had actually stopped his kids, who at the time were quite young, from sort of 2 to 8, and he had stopped them from watching that, and it was sort of prime time at sort of 7 or so o'clock in the evening, and I was surprised, how come? And he said the kids are now answering back in such a rude way that they're basically behaving just like the kids in this particular cartoon. And it got me thinking. And indeed, they were talking back. They were being rude, disrespectful. And it was the first time I thought, wow, how significant that kind of being exposed to, for want of a better word, role models, are being exposed to behaviors, because we tend to, when I think a role model, to me, it's almost exclusively positive. But in this instance, it clearly wasn't. That it's exposing the mind, impressionable young minds, to behaviors that they then see as normal. They don't know that necessarily that's not something acceptable, certainly not something to emulate. And so the importance of, if we as a society cannot yet ensure the quality of what we put on our TVs, or indeed video games, there are video games research that's been done that very much shows that the predominance of violent video games is having an impact, an unfortunate impact on the minds of kids. So longitudinal research has shown that it's likely to make kids less caring, less empathetic, and more likely to be antisocial. The research actually went in after the shootings in the US, and they didn't find a link in terms of violent behaviors. But what they did find was the psychological and emotional impact was certainly not something that I think any parent would desire for their kids. And that's also to flag, the research also showed that there are a smaller proportion of video games are pro-social. And so that did encourage a more constructive thinking in kids, and sort of more pro-social behaviors. But it just shows again that need for parents to be a filter at times, an active filter, to ensure that what the kids are exposed to is something that aligns with their own values. So coming back to dysfunctional families, she makes the point that, as we know, there can be individuals who are authoritarian, from a spiritual perspective, lack maturity, and who, in her words, project their own inner torment, their own issues onto the defenseless little beings who are temporarily in their care, and that in turn causes the family to become dysfunctional. So the family institution itself is not the issue, but the imbalance of the individuals, the adults within it. And so home represents an opportunity for the child to become those first steps in becoming socialized, learning about relationships, absorbing the experiences of the generations before. So seeing those, again, role models, for want of a better word. So naturally taking in those habits, and where it's positive, that these can become habits that will help guide them through their life in a safe way. So as she points out, when the family works well, it's an unsurpassable way to help lay the foundations of a harmonious society, and learning to develop respect for others and to think of others. But if the habits in the family are not healthy, then the child is left at the mercy of the issues coming in from the outside world. So it's turning, if it's not if that psychological shelter, let's say, or even just availability of time isn't there, then they'll turn to the outside world and will expose themselves to role models that are of a less than superior nature. And so they can end up developing defense mechanisms that can come across, as we mentioned earlier, as being quite arrogant or aggressive. And that reminded me, when I read that, of reading an article about a guy who is a big YouTube star. And I was astonished because I read he'd millions of followers and making loads of money because he's got millions of followers. And so I was like, what's he talking about? Why are millions of people tuning into this guy? And then I listened in for, it only took a few minutes for me to switch off. He was either talking about quite inane things or and really quite superficial, but at one point really talking in very derogatory ways about women and about treating women badly. And I just thought, my God, imagine young teens listening to this. And maybe could they possibly see this as normal? And so it just got me thinking about how powerful these influencers can be, and the need for guidance from caring adults in the lives of kids to ensure that they don't expose themselves to things that would potentially send their thinking and behaviors off in a way that could be really quite detrimental. Another example that comes to mind is parents who told me of a daughter who has a love of fashion, and that on Instagram, you know, there are certain influencers who are all about fast fashion, and basically, because they're being paid for product placement, you know, they're putting new fashions out there every week, and so the kids, as a result, are looking to basically change their fashion, likewise at a fast rate, which is, you know, nuts on a financial level, nuts on a climate change level, and also I think nuts on a psychological and emotional level, because it's about sort of developing more sense of one's self-esteem from within. Not obviously, I think, you know, we all want to be well dressed, and it's not to denigrate that, but again, you know, social media wasn't there when I was young, in the way that it is for kids now. And so, you know, the role of, and again, I say it, not just the parent, but the role of those that love the kids that are within that family, I think has become more challenging and also a greater opportunity. So just to then go on, please, Lawrence, to the next slide. This is the intermission, looking at a slide of some adorable families. It's just to basically show the family is a natural impulse within human nature. Amongst, obviously here we see mammals, even amongst birds and fish, and even some reptiles, crocodiles, skinks and lizards, or all have family units where basically they look out for each other, they help each other out. And it's interesting, I saw a talk by a spiritist neuroscientist who's also a vet, who gave an amazing talk on the evolution of love through the various different species, and basically talking how, and the brain, looking at, you know, the evolution of the brain. So at the very earlier stages, you know, single cell organism, right through to, let's say, reptiles, and the reptilian brain, which is, you know, fear, fight and flight, very much about survival instincts. But then the develop of the amphibian and the mammalian brain, where more complex things such as, for example, that capacity, the pregnancy moved from something external, if you think of tadpoles who are abandoned by frogs, to something that is then taken into the body in mammals. And so creating physiologically nature, creating a closer link between the mother and the offspring. And then once birth given, you know, as you move through to higher and higher forms of life, that there is more and more closely knit family units being created. And she argued that effectively this is the development of moving from instinct into the development of love and affection, which, you know, if you pull back to the time horizon of looking at hundreds of thousands of years or even a million, then you would see it much more clearly. Than we wouldn't necessarily see ourselves evolving in that way. But if we pull back the camera and see across that sort of time horizon of moving from single cell to much more complex and higher forms of life, we can see how affection is something that is being more expressed the more you move up the food chain. Or food chain probably isn't the right word. Apologies to any vegetarians or vegans. So if we could just go on to the next slide, please, Lawrence. So here, this is family planning of a much more complex kind than we normally would anticipate it. And we hear in the Andre Luis books about how much thought and planning goes into putting together the family, the reincarnating family. It's not a random collection of souls. It's carefully and extensively planned. Spirits with mutual commitments to each other, which can be positive or in some cases negative, who come together in order to progress, either through healing difficult relationships from the past or coming back together with those with whom we have love and affection and shared interests. And often it can be a mix of both. So giving us a chance to move on from the past, to develop ourselves intellectually, ethically and morally, to develop tolerance, to develop forgiveness, to develop qualities that basically we really, really need if we're going to live in harmony with each other. And so, notwithstanding extensive planning prior to reincarnation, often due to very strong pull of physical pleasure, people can end up in very precipitous encounters and prematurely end up in situations that are not exactly where they would have wanted themselves to be, namely unwanted pregnancies. And so they can end up missing out on the opportunity to meet the person that they had planned to spend their life with and to build a family with. And so they can stray very far away from the spiritual plan and the path that was planned for them. And then when the time comes and they do meet the kindred spirit who they had planned to meet, the situation may longer be conducive to a happy get-together, and so can result in really painful and conflicting feelings for the two people involved. And so just to flag for her, she sort of basically talks about then these unwanted pregnancies and how then abortion can be sought out as a solution, which from a Spiritist perspective, we know from many of the writings the messages sent through can have very painful consequences for the people involved, and that at some point that will need to be healed. And so effectively, if we could move on to the next slide, please, Lawrence. She would highlight the importance of looking at developing relationships based on friendship, based on shared interests, and learning to control the physical so as to then be able to enjoy it in a wonderful way with the person that one would be happy to spend time with, and spend time with being a parent, somebody that one could rely on. And she effectively says that relationships based purely on sexual attraction can prevent people from really getting to know each other, can end up frustrating, because people can end up going into it just looking for sex, and already planning their exit, going in emotionally indifferent towards the other person, and that without necessarily meaning it, could end up actually hurting themselves and hurting others. And she draws a parallel with sort of that sort of consumeristic theme that we see about sort of almost like the fast fashion, fast moving consumer goods, that relationships of that type can be are not nourishing psychologically and emotionally, and can end up with consequences that are that may have ramifications for that individual, and then for a family that may ensue as a result. But there are countless exceptions, particularly amongst those who wait to meet the right person, who where they really have deep feelings and love just being in each other's company, so that a good connection is there, and a good relationship can be established, that then will result in them attracting the children and the spirits who had been planned in advance prior to their reincarnation. So in her words, dating is that first step on the road to the development of affection and mutual respect, which will lay the foundations of a healthy home life. So she makes the point, yes, sex is essential, but it's the feelings of love that will really help the couple to face into any challenges, any obstacles that will arise in the future, when there could be problems in the relationship, either from within or stressors from without, unemployment, financial difficulties, whatever it may be. And then when the spirits that were planned as the kids are reborn into the home, that again, that can really put a stress on many marriages. And if that foundation, that bedrock has been put in place, that can provide real stability for the couple, but also for the kids that are the spirits that are being reborn into the home. And so effectively, this got me thinking about some research that I've been reading relatively recently by a US psychologist called John Gottman, where he has spent 40 years of his life doing research on hundreds and hundreds of couples, looking at those that ended in divorce and looking at those that were successful, and looking for themes. And he's written a number of books with his findings, and his wife, he and his wife have done this research together, as well as a whole team around them. And one of his books is about the seven principles, I think, of successful marriages. Don't quote me on the title, but the first principle that he talks about is building out what he calls love maps, which is effectively getting to know each other intimately. And he gives examples of questions that couples could ask each other. And to be fair, reading through the questions, this could be for any relationship to deepen the relationship. So it's really getting into what are your hopes, your aspirations for your life, what are the fears, what are the values, really important questions and things to know about each other. And because what he found was that the healthy relationships and the successful relationships, that in observing the interactions within these couples, that they knew each other intimately. They knew each other inside out. They knew each other so, so well. There was a very strong, effectively a very strong friendship. They were each other's best friend. And this is, again, I'm bringing this in because this is an evidence base that, 40 years of research that effectively confirms the point that she makes about the importance of those dating stage to establish a really strong connection of a foundation that will be as solid as possible for the future couple and family that may come in. The second principle, just in passing to flank, is fondness and admiration, which effectively is, in the couples that divorce, it was criticism, and in the successful couples, that they had a bias towards really admiring their spouse, towards being incredibly fond of them, so that even when difficulties arose, that somehow their default, their impulse, their natural thing was to remember the things that they were fond of in the other, and that they would voice what they admired easily. Whereas with the other couples, that when they asked them, even if a couple was in difficulties, that they would then ask, what did you admire? What attracted you first? What were you fond of? What did you love? That they would bring it back. And he felt that was like embers in a fire that had gone down but hadn't gone out, because it could be fanned, that they could focus again in on what they actually, the reason why they got together in the first place. Whereas the couples where that was gone, that the fire had completely gone out, there was no embers left, that was where they knew that it was going to end in divorce. So really, really interesting research, and a lot, I think, to learn from their work in terms of best practice. So just conscious of time, if you wouldn't mind, please, Lawrence, moving on to the next one, Families, a School of Blessings. So she makes the point, the family is a training ground where feelings and emotions really get stirred up, and there's nobody better to press our buttons than a member of our family. But she frames it in an interesting way, that it's ultimately to help us to develop our self-awareness and to learn how to deal with that in better and better ways, so that we then get to the point where there are positive outcomes from this. We may not be born into the ideal family that we would ideally wish for, but we're born into the family that we need to learn to develop the qualities that we need to develop. That we have evolutionary needs, and this is what is considered when the family is planned in advance. And that at times disturbing memories can arise unconsciously or otherwise, that could be from time in the spiritual world or from previous lifetimes. They can surface, and that they need to be worked through in order to transform them into much more constructive emotions. So effectively, this is when we're reborn into a family where it may be with an individual where we really have issues, but that it's with a view to healing that it's something that with the more advanced thinking that we have now than we would have had, let's say, in the 18th or 19th century, that certain reflexes may come up, but then the rational mind can actually take over. Or, if we're part of a particular spiritual tradition and we really want to adhere to it, that we start thinking about, okay, learning to forgive, learning to be patient, to be tolerant, to be compassionate, that, somebody's behaving like this is because they're upset, or they're, that they have their challenges as well. And also realizing, obviously, that none of us are perfect, and that we ourselves can press people's buttons, and the need for us to improve our reflexes, our reactions, so that we begin to harmonize a bit better with each other. So effectively, you know, we have that choice about, do we become resentful, do we become aggressive towards each other, or do we start to move down more towards being forgiving, understanding, and compassionate towards each other. And it's a journey. It's not a light switch moment. There may be a light switch moment of realizing it, but in terms of changing our reactions, it obviously is something that is iterative and really takes time. And I think being patient with ourselves as we go through that process. She makes the point that we've nowhere to hide our flaws in a family setting. Our family knows us probably better than anyone else. And so those imperfections will get chipped away by that constant exposure and continuous friction that we'll go through with family members. So just then to close off on the last slide, please. Effectively, the ties between parents and children are never broken. This is kind of the difference between humans and animals. Again, looking at, you know, the family as something that's evolving. So even when relations are strained, the ties are never really fully broken. They can end up just being postponed. So if family members fall out, there will be time in the spirit world, or indeed in another incarnation. Opportunities will come back for us to go through experiences until hurt is transformed into healing, until acrimony is transformed into understanding, and eventually affection for each other. And time and effort will make a huge difference. And this is where spiritual teachings and ideas can really be of benefit in helping us to lean on those resources when we get challenged in our relationships, to develop the qualities to improve our relationships with ourselves and with each other. And from a spiritist perspective, it's something that is encouraged, is why wait until the next reincarnation to fix things? Far better to forgive and to aim to heal things in this one while we have this opportunity. Not to preach to anybody, because every situation is different, and each needs to be seen on a case-by-case basis. But just simply to look at things, I guess, from that sort of longer timeline, that it's not like there's a cutoff point at the end of this life, that we will still need to heal things that perhaps we've brought from previous incarnations. And so that ultimately the divine is such that it's really only through love that we will find real happiness and real fulfillment. And the family is the way in which that can be developed, where we may end up learning, or certainly the intention is to learn things like self-sacrifice, patience, kindness, tenderness, affection, all the good things that I think all of us would love to have naturally. But in many cases, it's about training ourselves and developing these qualities over time, until we learn to develop love that goes beyond the immediate family and becomes something that deepens and grows, so that it overflows into broader society. And so I'm remembering a Church of England minister who was on BBC Two Radio 2 one morning and talking about, in his thought for the day, how all his kids had flown the nest, and how he and his wife basically had then decided that they would then extend their love and their parenting to foster caring. And I just thought, wow, how lovely that they'd done their work with their immediate family, and now they were reaching out to love those that really, really needed it. And so in effect, her point, Joanna D'Angela's point, is that the family, the home, is that training ground for us to learn to develop that greater love. That is the destination that we're heading towards, and some are closer to it than others. That more universal love that the Greeks called agape, a higher form of love, a love for all of humanity, that eventually, someday, we will get there. And so, on that note, I'll finish up. Apologies, ran slightly over.
Thank you, Tanya. What a wonderful talk. I would like to go to our questions and answers, because there are some questions popping up here from our friends on Facebook and YouTube. So I'm going to start from a comment from Sue. She says, my experience is that the psychological, emotional, and physical danger was lurking within the home, both growing up and also living with father and my own 2 children.
I'm very, very sorry, Sue, to hear that this was your experience. Clearly, that's must have caused incredible suffering for you, and I would hope that the fact, I guess, that you're here today, that you're looking into the spiritual to find a way of understanding the situation in a bigger context, and also other resources to complement that. Obviously, not just the spiritual, to bring healing for you and for all involved. We know that from a spiritist perspective, that often, as I mentioned, that there can be ties between spirits from the past, and that not always will what is planned work out in the way that had been planned, and so not to lose hope, I guess, for the future, and from a spiritual perspective, to find to go deep and find healing through forgiveness, which I certainly wouldn't be the one to say how for you to heal that. That is something to come through your own introspection, and also I think leaning on those professional supports, but also through prayer, through healing, spiritual healing, and praying for a perspective that can help, which will probably guide you to the resources, to the books, to lectures, to individuals that can help bring healing to yourself and to the family.
Thank you, Tanya. The next question actually is also from Sue. She says, how do you feel it is possible to change the pattern of dysfunctional families and damaged people from continuing the patterns throughout the family lineage? Also, without trying to mold people into a cold, acceptable shape, where they become totally neutralized and unable to be true expression of themselves and who they really are?
Really interesting question. I am no expert in this. I'm fortunate to have met somebody who is a family support worker for 20 years, particularly working within domestic violence and abuse situations. And she got to the point where exactly that thing about breaking the cycle was something that she was convinced was actually the way forward. And so she has, over the last few years, started to work with children, early and mid-teens, to teach them about communication, to teach them about boundaries, to teach them about sexual education, to have dialogue, to have the conversation, and how to express themselves psychologically and emotionally. And so far, the feedback has been good. It's just been a couple of years, so it's been about 4 years, I think. But particularly, you know, the pilot was a couple of years ago, and now it's rolling out more, and it's moving online, or it has moved online. It was accelerated by COVID, because she became convinced that this was the way to break that passing on, like in the book Joanna de Angelis was talking about, that imprinting, continuing, that, you know, those patterns of behavior, that if somebody has learned a certain way of communicating, that's the norm in their family unit, and they pass that on. And so that effectively she was looking to teach these kids to normalize what is acceptable and what is not acceptable in terms of relationships, and normalizing it within the class, so across that class, where people could well be ending up in relationships with each other in those important formative years, so that they were all kind of operating off, I wouldn't say the same hymn sheet, but at least aware of the different hymn sheets. So I think, to me, that's an interesting way about changing that pattern. And then in terms of damaged people, I struggle with that word. I think we're all at varying levels of learning and growth, and we can hurt each other. But I don't necessarily, I struggle with the word damaged. I think we can be hurt, and healing can come, I think, in different ways. And so certainly psychology and psychotherapy can be great for the adult who has been hurt, and in some cases very, very badly hurt. It can be very physical, psychological, emotional, and also in other ways. I'm thinking in this. Forgive me if this sounds. I'll give it as I came across it, but basically a woman who came out of a very abusive relationship, who got healing, but then effectively she just resolutely started to imagine herself in a relationship that was the antithesis of where she had been, and just kept imagining, and it was almost like in her mind, mentally, she was creating that man, that relationship, that situation. And within a few years, she met somebody where it was, her mindset had been so transformed about how she saw men, that she was on a different frequency, and she attracted quite a very, very different type of person who treated her with respect, and they had a happy and successful relationship. Now, that sounds facile, and my apologies for that, but I thought it was just maybe, that was the situation for that spirit, and every individual is different. But I think certainly through psychology and psychotherapy, and I would also suggest reading on the spiritual psychology side as well, to develop an understanding of that bigger context, to bring healing. Actually, the spirit Joanna de Angelis, it's written that back in the lifetime that a lifetime from when apparently she overlapped with Jesus, and that she met Jesus a couple of times in her life. During that reincarnation, she was married to a man who was a very wealthy merchant, and he was very abusive, very, very abusive towards her. physically, psychologically, and emotionally, and spoke to Jesus about leaving, and he said, just hang there for the moment, and she did, and very shortly after, the man actually passed away, and she was free. I'm not suggesting that people should stay in abusive relationships at all. I'm just describing what that spirit's experience was. And so, you know, it's not as if she doesn't have an understanding of what that can be.
Thank you, Tanya. Next question is from our lovely friend Elsa. She says, there are adopted children that grow so identical to foster parents that is incredible. How Spiritists could explain that?
Well, as we know, the second slide that I showed speaks of how we have spiritual family and then we have biological family. And so there may well be children that are not biologically part of the family, or may not have been born biologically into the family, but that are adopted into the family and effectively reunited with those that they love, where they have great affinity. Now, you're saying grow identical to the foster parents, so it may be, you know, can be positive, negative, or otherwise, but that there is affinity, whether it's of a positive or a negative nature, that naturally that they attract each other, but also that, you know, there is that thing of imprinting that we know from psychology. We even know it from animals, where children will start to imitate. But in this case, I would say that really that the relationship is restarting. It's not a new relationship. It's a restarting of a relationship that may well go back many, many centuries.
Cool. Next question comes from Bob Williams. He says, if a child spirit has had good experience from past life, can this good pattern overcome any bad influence that might be present in their current biological family?
Interesting question, Bob. If a spirit has developed good qualities and decides to test them by being born into circumstances that will sorely test them, then if they triumph, they will overcome. Let's say if somebody is born into a family where there may be criminality, you know, stealing, for example, and yet the child resists the temptation to go down that road because of an innate sense that is not, for them, that is not right, that they're strong enough to resist it. Somebody who's born into a different family where that's not even a feature doesn't go down that road. But we never know that actually, if we were born into real poverty, if we were born into a very unfair situation, and if we saw unfairness and corruption around us, we don't know how tempted we would be and how we would justify turning to crime as a way of addressing that injustice as we would see it. Whereas a spirit who really has grown and developed will still manage to resist that pull of going down that road, and still find ways of resisting that temptation, shall we say.
Thank you. And then going to our last question of the evening, that is from our friend Gabrielle. She says, adults that have suffered child sex abuse and could not communicate with any adult about it, what the main effects in their psyche, and how could they start to overcome it?
This is a very deep question, and I have to say, Gabrielle, I'm not a psychologist. I'm not a specialist in the area. It is again, it's sort of pulling back and looking at it from a broader spiritual perspective, but also accessing professional supports from a psychologist or a psychotherapist who has effectively has advertised that this is an area that they are experienced in, and the effects on the psyche, you know, can be very very varied. So for some it could be that they numb themselves. For others it could be that they can turn to poor coping mechanisms, drug and alcohol abuse, abusive relationships. For some it could be that they could unconsciously bury it, but nevertheless it's there operating under the radar unconsciously and driving behaviors without the individual realizing it. But with good, loving, caring support from a trained professional, this can be healed, but it's not to underestimate the time that it takes and the courage that it takes for the individual to go through that healing. And I think it can help, to know that there is this longer time horizon in front of us, that we're not just in this one body, we're not just in this one lifetime, and that healing will come, and that the time horizons open up and lives open up before us. It can also mean that the individual may develop a greater understanding and compassion and empathy for the suffering of others, and in time, as a result of that, become a source of support and love and understanding for others, but not until a sufficient amount of healing has happened to prepare themselves. So first, depending on the extent of the hurt and the suffering, accessing support, psychological, psychotherapeutic support to work through it, and to as well allow oneself to be supported by those that are really that person can trust. And I mean trust in the sense of psychologically and emotionally, that they feel safe psychologically and emotionally with them, who have more maturity, who have a capacity to hold that space, to hold that conversation. If the individual is going through therapy, it can bring things up that they can feel safe to talk about their process. But not everybody will be mature enough or psychologically and emotionally effectively mature or advanced enough to be able to hold that space. So it's knowing who that one or two, or if you're lucky, 3 people that conversation could happen with, that could be a great resource to be a support while going through that process of healing.
Thank you, Tanya. Thank you very much. A message here from our lovely friends Anna Sinclair, who is going to be here with us next meeting on the 18th of June. Anna said, "Thank you, Anna, very thought-provoking."
That last slide relates to a talk Anna gave many years ago that really struck me, which was why wait until the next reincarnation to really use the life that we're in to make as much progress as we can with our families.
So our next meeting will be on the 18th of June, and our next speaker is Marlon Haigdal, and Anna Sinclair will be here with us translating the evening. Is there any closing remarks from you, Tanya or Lawrence, before we go to the closing prayer?
I've thoroughly enjoyed it. Thank you very much. And really fitting as well of this time, because we have our first family gathering service this coming Sunday. So it's just lovely the way this all meshes together. So thank you. And I did smile because we were talking about Nosolar beforehand, and then the picture came up from Nosolar. And I went, oh, look, there it is. Beautiful evening, Tanya. Thank you so much.
No, thank you guys for your help. And again, my apologies if I have pressed people's buttons. I would urge people to read the book itself, to look into the other books that the Spiritual Evangelist has written through Divaldo, because I can't do justice truly to what she says. It can be a very delicate subject, and it can be such a big subject, and so I hope it will be a trigger for people to deepen, as it is for me, to deepen the studies, to learn more.
Indeed.
Thank you, Tanya, and thank you everyone that has been watching us. And I would like to hand it over to Lawrence for the closing prayer.
Thank you, Fabricio. So once more, dear friends, just draw into that silence within. Find that point of perfect peace, balance, harmony and unity. And link in with that divine essence, that divinity which runs through all things. And just know and trust that we are here on pathways. There is no success, no fail, but just to achieve the best that we can be. Amen.
Amen. Thank you, everyone, and I hope to see you on the 18th of June. Good night. Okay. Bye now.
Before we go, Fabricio, quickly, I think Elsa was trying to share a link there for tomorrow. Correct me if I'm wrong, Elsa. And I'm sure she will. So that's online tomorrow, and it's 2:00 Eastern District Time, which works out to 7 p.m. in the UK. So it's about mediums and mediumship. It's on Saturday and Sunday, so it's 7 p.m. UK time. But the link to the website is in the comments section. Yes, it is. I've got it right. Yeah, Elsa says yes. That's fine. That's my day complete. Thank you. And good night, everybody.
Good night.
Okay. Night.